All right, it looks like we're live. Is this my first ever solo? I do believe this is my first ever solo live stream. So let's just jump right into it. Should Christians today, uh, wherever you are, practice things like magic crystals? Go to things like fortune tellers? Is it harmless? Is it harmful? What's all going on there? Um, Surprising, it might just seem like an obvious answer, like no, right? We're Christians. We've read the Bible. If you've read particularly the Old Testament, you know maybe that's not a thing we should do. Surprisingly, there are a lot of Christians, and I've been having a lot of conversations with Christian friends of mine who have talked about. They'll say, "Hey, what do you think about using crystals?" And I'll say, "Why do you ask?" And they'll say, "Well, because these guys I know they say they're Christians, but then they're using crystals. And on the one hand, they think maybe God created nature, so if crystals are part of nature, why couldn't we use them? Or and then of course you can take the other route where, well, okay, well maybe God isn't going to do anything through crystals, but then isn't when it couldn't just be harmless imagination, right? And I feel like that's kind of the thing. It's typically answered from two places. This kind of question. On the one hand, you can have the more secular position, which is just, well, it's all bunk, right? People can't tell the future. There's no such thing as magic crystals. Magic isn't a real thing. It's wishful thinking or people doing magic tricks or whatever. But then you can have people on the other side, maybe who are more fundamentalist Christian, answer it and say, well, you're going to be worshiping demons. Period. You get into that stuff if it's a Ouija board, if it's a tarot cards, fortune teller. It's all demonic. Even if people don't know they're doing demonic, it's worshiping demons. Um, and so I'm gonna try to take a middle of the road there from my perspective as a Christian. Okay, so that's my bias. If you're an atheist watching this might not be the episode for you. Um, but from my perspective as a rational thinker, a logical thinker, and a Christian, I'm gonna answer this question drawing from some passages in Deuteronomy, and then go fast forwarding to the New Testament in Acts. And actually, this is quite embarrassing doing this live. I don't have this right on me. I should have. I started late. I've already been doing a lot of last minute work trying to import some things and images. I actually want to show you guys the Bible that I'm going to be reading out of. I got this for Christmas a couple years ago. This is amazing. It's the Apologetics Study Bible. It's got all kinds of great articles in here. It's got places in here that has little footnotes that tells you about all kinds of different things. So this actually stemmed. It was funny. I was having a conversation with somebody a while ago. They were talking about going to fortune tellers, and they're saying, well, isn't prophets a thing? Like, there are prophets in the church, and they're supposed to tell you the future, and of course that's a thing in the Bible. There's people who can have dreams and visions of the future. So, couldn't a fortune teller, couldn't it be like something like that, like coming from God? And then ironically, obviously I disagreed, but then I started reading Deuteronomy, and I was like, and then there was a passage that directly talked about it. So let me start on this note before anything. I think, and this is where I would agree with the skeptic, I think as a magician, right, as a person who does magic tricks and knows a lot about that kind of thing, I think probably 99% of what we see with regard to fortune tellers, with regard to, say, spiritual mediums, people claiming to communicate with your dead relatives, things like that, I think 99% of it, especially in the West, it's just people doing magic tricks. I don't necessarily think that demons show up every single time something like this happens. I think if a bunch of teenagers get together and they have a Ouija board, they're just being drunk, silly teenagers, right? And it's what it is in most of the movies, right? Where it turns out, oh, one of the kids is moving it, and there's not really a spirit. Of course, then if it's a horror movie, there's always the cheesy twist. Oh, there is a spirit controlling it. But I think 99% of it is just people doing magic tricks. Again, especially in the West. Now, again, as a Christian, I do believe that there is a spiritual realm. I do believe that obviously God exists and angels exist, and so there's that side. But then I do believe there are demonic spirits. And if you talk to people like my pastor, who he grew up in third world places, and he's seen a lot of stuff that goes on over there, and he can tell you about the negative spirits. He can tell you about actual practicing witches, not just the stereotype what you see kind of in American Halloween kids costumes and things like that, but actual witches who do actual supernatural magic. And of course, we as Christians believe that does come from a demonic realm. So I'm not denying that. I want to be clear, and we'll see that as I get into the passages I'm going to read, especially from Deuteronomy. But I think most of what we're seeing, especially in the West, I would agree with the skeptic. I would think, yeah, it's just people doing magic tricks. And even you see this represented sometimes in movies and books like The Prestige, where there will be kind of these rivaling magicians, especially back in the day. You know, people were, you could say, a lot more gullible to this sort of trick. And I don't use that. I don't want a negative connotation to necessarily go with that, because you can understand people that are maybe have lost a loved one and they're grieving, and so they're gonna maybe be drawn to someone who tells them they can communicate with their dead relative. I think most of those people are just doing magic tricks and they're just in it for the money. They're doing the same kind of magic tricks a regular magician would do, except what they're telling people is, oh, I can contact your dead relative, and they play on that kind of emotive response from the person that they want to be comforted, and so they're willing to buy into this thing, and of course they'll pay good money to see it happen, and so that's a good way for people. I'm not good morally, but that's one way for people to say make money doing these kinds of things. And again, in The Prestige, especially in the book, you see that kind of represented where this one magician knows of another magician. They actually get into a rival because the one magician is claiming to be able to contact the spirit world, and the other one doesn't like that. He says they're kind of a branch of magicians who kind of see that as that's wrong because we're lying. Like when I go up and do a magic trick, and people come to pay for it, they know they're paying to see a magician. But this guy, he's lying about what he's doing. He's just doing magic tricks, but he says he's contacting spirits. And so I'm going to expose him, and that kind of goes on in the book. He tries to sneak in as just a spectator, and then expose him for the magic tricks he's doing. But anyway, essentially what I'm saying is, yeah. And look, Brian Brushwood. There's actually a YouTube video you can Google. I think it's called "How to Scam Your Way into Anything," and it's Brian Brushwood, who's a magician who has scam school, and he does kind of an hour-long stage show, and he does these tricks, and he says, look, if you didn't know, this seems like a genuine demonstration of ESP, of I have to have. How else could you explain this magic trick other than I had some kind of psychic ability and could communicate that some kind of way? And then especially nowadays, think nowadays, especially people who do this so much that you would get put on a waiting list if you're going to get to see like let's say a professional person who contacts your spirits, right? And of course these people, it's always the same excuse. Well, they told me things about me that they couldn't have known, or about my family history that they couldn't have known. Well, let me tell you this. Suppose it's a really famous person, and they have a waiting list, right? And it costs a lot of money because this guy's the best, right? He tells you, he's clearly psychic. He tells you things about yourself. There's no way he could have known. He knows things about your family, and he knows your relatives' names before you even tell them, who have passed on. And so he's the best, and there's a 6-month waiting list if you want to get. So you contact him, you give him your name, your number, probably credit card information, because maybe you got to put a down payment or whatever. Well, let me tell you, in 6 months, with just your name, maybe he even asks your birthday too, probably asks your birthday, your address, and your credit card information, how much can he find out about you in 6 months? How much research can he do with the access we have today with the internet? How much can he find out about you and your family history in 6 months? So I think the clear explanation is, I would agree 100% with the skeptic here. I think he's just doing a magic trick. He's just doing tricks, and he just does research, and he knows things about you because just from research. It's not psychic, right? But again, you can understand why somebody who maybe doesn't have a solid grounding in their worldview, and maybe who hasn't thought things through a lot. Again, whether you're Christian or atheist or whatever, agnostic, maybe you haven't thought through it that much. And so something like this, it certainly seems possible, right? Maybe you're an agnostic, and so you're open to the idea of a soul. And if you're open to the idea of a soul, you're open to the idea of ghosts. And so something like this can at least seem plausible and possible to you. And especially if someone knows how to present it really well, it can come off as really convincing. And so I think most of that stuff, most Ouija boards with magic crystals, actually, I'm going to be honest, I don't know a whole lot about magic crystals, right? The main thing I would know is like tarot cards, fortune tellings, spiritual mediums. I think these people are doing magic tricks. And that's really what it comes down to. I mean, I do things for people. I do tricks for people all the time. And somebody will say, there's no way that could have really just happened. But there is. There is. And that's just the reality of it. So I think most of the time that's what you're getting into. And again, I can understand, I can sympathize. I don't want to be too repetitive here, but with someone who wants to believe that. And then you just have people who, hey, look, it's 2019. Our magic tricks are really advanced and our technology is really advanced to find out things about people. So, again, that can be the case. So, okay, so that's kind of my more just generic observation of what's going on is I think if you go see somebody, and I don't mean to be harsh here, but if you go see somebody who says they're contacting your dead relatives, I think you're getting scammed. I think you're paying for someone to do a magic trick. And hey, if you willingly want to buy into that scam because it makes you feel better, that you can do that. But I'm just letting you know, again, go watch the video. Just put it in, type in the YouTube search engine, Brian Brushwood, how to scam your way into anything. Okay, so there's that part. Now I'm going to shift into the biblical data on this. And so again, if you're an atheist, maybe this part isn't for you. This is me just as a Christian. That's my bias here. Christian is going to the Bible and saying, okay, what does the Bible say about these kinds of things? And so we are going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 18, and we're going to start in verse 9. So the context here is really important. So most people are familiar with the idea of God is leading the Israelites. I apologize, my voice is getting scratchy. God is leading the Israelites into the land of Canaan. And if you watch guys like Frank Turek, and then you know typically what the Canaanites were being judged for was one of the main things was child sacrifice. They were sacrificing their children to this god Molech, like they were basically burning their children alive, serving this false god. And so that's one of the major things that the Canaanites were being judged for and being driven out of the land. And so using Israelites' army to do that was one of the ways God judged the Canaanites. But even leading up to all this, the Israelites were constantly not obeying the commandments, right? They were constantly having trouble obeying all the laws of Moses, and they had themselves had to be judged several times. But so leading up to this, Moses is constantly giving instruction to the people on how to properly worship God. And I know there's stuff in there. There's like animal sacrifice, which we don't believe applies to today. We believe that God was more work. They kind of, animal sacrifice was just such a common thing. And so this was kind of a gradual unfolding. God was saying, okay, at least first just start sacrificing out animals to me instead of false gods. And then we're going to phase that out because obviously killing animals isn't the ideal. But anyway, Moses is giving the Israelites all these laws and all these plans. And so in this passage, chapter 18, verse 9, God is specifically warning the Israelites about things not to do. So we're going to look at the first passage here. So this is a call practice. I'm reading from the version, it's HCSB. So when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not imitate the detestable customs of those nations. No one among you is to make his son or daughter pass through the fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, practice sorcery, cast spells, consult a medium or a familiar spirit, or inquire of the dead. All right, so that's most of the stuff we were just talking about. Everyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, and the Lord your God is driving out the nations before you because of these detestable things. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. Though these nations you are about to drive out listen to fortune tellers and diviners, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do this. So, there you have it. Basically, what God is saying is, okay, there are certain practices that you do in worship to me. And remember, the first commandment is, thou shalt not have any gods before me. And he's saying what it looks like when people worship other gods is exactly these things, consulting spiritual mediums, telling fortunes. And he couples that right in there with sacrificing your children, especially through the fire. Now, I am going to go on here just because I do think it has some implications, kind of a side note I want to make. To chapter 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. This is what you requested from the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly when you said, let us not continue to hear the voice of the Lord our God or see this great fire any longer so that we will not die. Then the Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. I will hold accountable whoever does not listen to my words that he speaks in my name. But the prophet who dares to speak in my name a message I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet must die. So this is really important, because as far as kind of today's prophets, there are a lot of people in church who say, well, they're modern day prophets, and they'll have the prophetic word and they'll speak good things over you. And this is probably a controversial opinion. I think most of them mean well. I don't think they're genuine prophets. I just don't. And here, specifically in this context in Deuteronomy, God's saying, hey, look, if I send you a prophet, if someone is actually speaking of the future on behalf of me, there's a way you can test that. They make a specific prediction, they say it, and then it comes true. And a lot of the so-called prophets in churches today say these really generic things that there's really no way to test. Oh, you're going to have a good year, or I see good things coming for you, or they'll pray for you and they'll say, and this thing I just prayed, it will be healed in the next week. Now, of course, if they could say a specific date and it happened, that'd be, again, testable. But most of it's not like that. And so I'm really skeptical of a lot of these things. Let me finish the passage here. You must say to yourself, how can we recognize a message the Lord has not spoken when the prophet speaks in the Lord's name and the message does not come true or is not fulfilled? That is a message the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him. So, there you go. Right? So, if God sends a specific prophet, there's a way to test it. Right? It's not just someone making very generic statements about positive outlooks or things like that. And again, to go back to the other stuff, that God's saying this is specifically worship of false gods. Now, that can very easily tie into all the stuff I was saying before, right? You could fast forward it to today and say, okay, well, they're not worshiping false gods necessarily. Maybe some of them are, right? But you could say the person who's consulting a spiritual medium isn't necessarily worshiping a false god, or the person that you go and, you see the kind of the neon sign on the street is just a random tarot card reading or palm reading or fortune teller thing. Maybe they're not worshiping a false god. Maybe they're just making ends meet, right? They know how to do magic tricks. They get people to come in who buy into that kind of thing. And it's just magic tricks. And you could say maybe it's not necessarily a false god, but it could tie into that in the sense that you could say, for all intents and purposes, in the context here, maybe the Canaanites were just doing these things, and maybe they were tricking their own people, right? Maybe it was magicians for that time. And maybe that's a lot of it, especially today. However, I do want to fast forward to Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 17. And again, this goes back to what I said about my pastor, who's seen some of this kind of demonic activity in third world places he's been to. And he's not a crazy person, by the way. I trust him and I believe him. But this is specifically talking about, okay, because Moses at this point knows he's not going to the promised land. He knows but he knows the Israelites are going to get there. And of course, there's kind of this prophetic word of, hey, the Israelites are going to turn away from God, the true God. And they are going to start engaging in all these other things. But this is the Song of Moses, and this is more of a warning of what's going to happen to you. And I just want to pull this one verse out of here and show it to you. Verse 17, they sacrificed to demons, not God, to gods they had not known, new gods that had just arrived, which your fathers did not fear. So this again, the skeptic might agree with most of the stuff I've said up to this point about it's just magic tricks, but this is where, as a Christian, I do believe that there can be a spiritual element. Again, I think in 99% of the cases, just people doing magic tricks, but I do believe as a Christian that there's such thing as demons, and that they can, and in biblical history, and it seems that they did that this was the case with the Canaanites, that even though people think they're worshiping two false gods, because they're not worshiping the true God, because they're directly disobeying the true God and making up gods, that is a door that demons can get in through. And so it certainly can be the case, and I think as Christians, again, there's kind of the idea of, well, if we just believe it's a magic trick, is there really any harm in doing things? Like if I'm at a party and somebody pulls out a Ouija board, oh, I believe it's just fake. So is there really any harm in me engaging it? And I would just say, as Christians, let's just play on the safe side, because if we have biblical evidence that this is a way demons can kind of sneak in the back door, I would say as Christians, let's just stay away from that. Let's not even take a chance, because it does seem that this is the case in this context. It does seem that this happens in third world countries now. Again, it's not as prominent in America, and then that's a whole other discussion of why. Like, this is just kind of special pleading, because I, as an American, am in the West, and I could just kind of write it off as all fake magic tricks. But another place that I can't directly observe, or maybe the person I'm having a discussion with can't directly observe, well, there it's really happening. That's a whole other discussion to get into, of why it might be the case that these kinds of things happen like that nowadays. But just for the sake of this discussion, I certainly think it's possible. It's at least within the realm of possibility. Again, granted the Christian worldview, it's at least possible that even something doing this, like in America, a demon can get in through a back door, because it's a practice that God is directly associating. He's saying, hey, if you're worshiping me, you're not doing these things. If you're doing these things, you're worshiping false gods. And then the verse that's up right now, even though they thought they were doing new gods that had just arrived, meaning they're just making them up, because this happened all the time, especially in the book of Judah, Israelite was constantly rebelling and just making up, worshiping false gods and things. But this verse is saying they're inadvertently sacrificing to demons when this happens. So it certainly does seem that that's a possibility. Now, real quick before I go to Q&A, if anyone has any questions, I am going to skip to the New Testament, because you might say, well, but is this just for the Old Testament? Right? Because we know there's a lot of stuff like that. We know shellfish was just an Old Testament thing. We know you couldn't eat meat after like 3 days was an Old Testament thing. You couldn't get tattoos. That was an Old Testament thing. Of course, we don't believe that those things apply today, because those were in clear distinction to the moral laws stated in the Old Testament, which do apply today. These were civil and ceremonial laws that don't apply today. So is this just one of those things? Is this, now real quick before, I believe I lost my place, which is, nope, here it is. I meant to read this before, so right before we jump into the Old Testament, this is why this Bible is great. It has these, I don't know if you can see it in the camera, it has, probably not as blurry, it has these twisted scripture sections, right? So it does specifically invoke here, and this says, Deuteronomy 18:10-12. It says, one of the earliest exhortations to the people of God about the dangers of occult involvement. This passage lists 9 kinds of religious practices to avoid. 1. Making a child sacrifice to false gods. 2. Predicting the future or seeking hidden treasures through the aid of divine rods, pendulums, and other occult means. 3. Guiding one's affairs by the stars. 4. Using Ouija boards, crystals, etc. 5. Practicing sorcery. 6. Placing oneself into a trance or attempting to alter one's state of consciousness. 7. Attending seances, mixing potions. And 9. Becoming a spiritualist, medium, or one who attempts to communicate with the dead. Persons involved in occultism do not entrust their lives, present or future, to God, but rather seek to rule their affairs through forbidden means. And that's really important. Again, us as Christians, if you're a skeptic watching this, you've probably gotten your fill of me. You've agreed, yeah, it's just all magic tricks. That's what it is. But as Christians, if we do believe that God, especially if he's sovereign in our lives, God is saying, hey, trust me, don't seek it by these other means. So as Christians, we shouldn't be engaging in it. That's all I'm saying. And then, again, if you do believe that demons can do magic, say through other means, this is a backdoor for them to sneak into. So just avoid it. Now, again, before we go to Q&A, just going to, yes, I am using the Apologetics Bible JMD. I showed it at the beginning. Oh, that's not correct. Where's the cover? Oh, it's over there. I'm not going to go get it. Yes, it's an Apologetics Study Bible. I'll show you the cover after I read this passage. So we are going to fast forward to Acts. Acts. So this is after the time of Jesus. So Paul is known in all kinds of things. And so Paul and Jesus practice exorcism in his ministry. And it appears Paul does too. So we're going to pick it up at chapter 19. Acts chapter 19, verse 11. I'm going to pull it up right here. Demonism defeated at Ephesus. Ephesus? Did I say that right? I don't know. God was performing extraordinary miracles by Paul's hands, so that even face cloths or work aprons that had touched his skin were brought to the sick, and the diseases left them, and the evil spirits came out of them. Okay, so exorcism, casting an evil demon out of somebody. Pardon me. Sorry about that. Chapter 13, verse 13. Jeez, I can't speak tonight. Did I just have a seizure live on air? Jeez whiz. Then some of the itinerant Jewish exorcists attempted to pronounce the name of the Lord Jesus over those who had evil spirits, saying, I command you by the Jesus whom Paul preaches. Now, if you've seen any kind of movies today portraying this thing, like The Exorcist, you know, this is a common thing. Like Catholic priests will do, they'll say, in the name of Jesus, you know, I command you. Or maybe in the name of the saints, I command you. That kind of thing. And so it would seem, oh, that's all the Jewish exorcists are doing here. 7 sons of Skeva, Jewish chief priests, were doing this. The evil spirit answered them, Jesus I know, and Paul I recognize, but who are you? Then the man who had the evil spirits leaped on them, overpowered them all, and prevailed against them, so that they ran out of the house. They ran out of that house naked and wounded. This became known to everyone who lived in Ephesus, both Jews and Greeks. Then fear fell on all of them. Now, before I finish that passage, why did the demons prevail against the Jewish exorcists? Right, because Paul was doing this. Paul wasn't by his own power casting out demons and exorcising them. He was doing it by Jesus' power. So it would seem that the Jewish exorcists are just coming, they're just doing the same thing. They're saying, hey, in Jesus' name, out, and Jesus who Paul preaches, get out. But the demon says, well, I know Jesus and Paul. Who the heck are you? And the demons win. They prevail against the sons. So I want to go into the footnotes here, because it's very insightful. Again, this Bible is very insightful. So I'm just going to read this from the footnotes of that particular passage that we just read. The magical tradition of the ancient world often involved invoking names of divine figures as magical papery. I looked up that word ahead of time so I could pronounce it right, and I'm pretty sure I just didn't already. I forgot already. Papyri, and amulets indicate. So like that's just kind of magic rods, or physical objects that are supposed to have magical powers or imbued through by, I don't know, magic, some kind of magic. There are numerous Jewish magical texts that attest to the interplay of magic and Judaism. Here, some itinerant Jewish exorcists, apparently traveling around the countryside in search of money for performing magical acts, stumbled upon the unsuccessful use of Jesus' name. So, aha! So Paul, when he's exorcising demons, he is correctly calling on the authority of Jesus, who can exorcise demons. And in Jesus' power are exorcising demons. The Jewish magicians here, though, this isn't the same thing. This is a magical practice. This is a common magical practice, again, which we just, coming from the Old Testament, we know is forbidden by God. So the Jews here are engaging in magical behavior that's forbidden by God, but are invoking Jesus' name almost to use as a spell. So that's why the demons prevailed, because they weren't doing it in actual Jesus' authority and trusting in Jesus to do it, but they were specifically using Jesus' name kind of as a spell, and so it didn't work. So now let's finish the passage. Then fear fell on all of them, and the name of the Lord Jesus was magnified, and many who had become believers came confessing. So these are people who are now becoming believers in the actual Jesus, right? Confessing and disclosing their practices. Okay, so people who had previously engaged in these same magical practices that had just failed against the demons, now converting to be a Christian. While many of those who had practiced magic collected their books and burned them in front of everyone. So they calculated their value and found it to be 50,000 pieces of silver. In this way, the Lord's message flourished and prevailed. So this is really important, because it was after they burned their magic books that the Lord's message flourished and prevailed. So, again, going back to the original question of I think what I named the live stream, should Christians engage these practices? Absolutely not. Again, it wasn't even enough that they stopped practicing them. They actually had to burn whatever they were using. They had to burn their magical texts for the Lord's message to prevail. So, again, that's saying, and I know this sounds like the more fundamentalist view of you should even be careful of what objects or statues you have in your house. But hey, listen, play on the safe side. Maybe it's harmless. Maybe it genuinely is harmless, but maybe it's not. And in this context, and again, we kind of coming at it from a perspective of nowadays, where especially in the West, that kind of magical manifestation seems almost not apparent at all, right? So it's easy for us to just say, hey, what's the harm in this particular object or this practice? But in a context where this kind of thing is going on, it's extremely important. And so it wasn't enough for these people to just, in fact, I think I can read it from here. Ephesus, this is the footnotes again, had a reputation for magical practices so notable that magical texts were called Ephesian letters. Ephesus? And there's a name for that I'm not going to try to pronounce. When these magicians became believers, they burned their magical texts. So yeah. So I guess just to summarize here, and then maybe if anybody has any questions before I end the stream, they don't necessarily have to be on this subject. I'm not an expert on this subject by any means, right? This is just some stuff I figured out by reading the Bible, just thinking about it. So to summarize, whether it be fortune telling, spiritual mediums, magic crystals, whatever it is, I think 99% of it, especially in the West, is just people doing magic tricks, right? People, they can do research on you, they can find out the names of your relatives, and they can claim to be psychics and know things. I think most of it's just fake, and the skeptic, I'm sure, would be right on my side with that. But if you're a Christian and you do believe that there's God, so there's a source of good supernatural power, and then the demonic realm, so there's an evil source of supernatural power, manifestation. The Bible is explicitly saying that these specific practices, which God is saying is detestable, is not only trusting false gods instead of God, which is to disobey the first commandment, but it's a specific backdoor in which demons can get in, and especially in the case in the New Testament. So this isn't just a Old Testament ceremonial civil law. In the New Testament, people not only had to stop engaging in the practice, but actually had to burn their magical texts. So if you're a Christian, no, just stay away from it. Just play on the safe side. Again, maybe a specific case. Maybe if you're at a party, somebody pulls out a Ouija board, it's harmless. Nothing's going to happen. It's just teenagers being drunk or being stupid, right? But if there's even a chance, because we as Christians, we do believe that God is real and God has at least supernatural abilities. We also believe there's a demonic realm and they have supernatural abilities. So just play on the safe side. So, does anybody have any questions? Because now would be the time, so I don't just ramble endlessly or have dead air. It could be on this topic, or it could literally be on anything. I am open-minded about it. Let me... Well, if there are not any questions coming in, I'm going to go ahead and end the episode. I appreciate everyone who has been here and watching. Oh, it's after 10, so it is kind of late. I'm going to see if I can pull up the live chat on my phone. If there's live chat here, I don't know if it's delayed to the one on my computer screen, to be fair. It does not appear as though it is. There says there's 3 of you in the chat, so somebody should have a question for me, or just a comment. You can disagree with me, or you can add to what I've said, or if I've missed something, like a particularly compelling text from the Bible. Again, if you want to know where I read from, Deuteronomy chapter 18, Deuteronomy chapter 32, and then Acts chapter 19. Isn't religion the greatest scam of all time? Well, I did mention a video by Brian Brush. Yeah, definitely look that up. That's really, and I don't know if Brian Brushwood is religious. I don't know if he's an atheist. His presentation isn't at all from an apologetics or religious standpoint. It's just from his standpoint of a magician and a performer. It's called How to Scam Your Way into Anything. It's fairly old, but it's a brilliant video because he gets into the psychology of why people believe these things, and he even has a specific demonstration of he brings two people up on the stage who don't know each other, and he does a magic trick, and he says, "This would have to be if you didn't know better, it would seem as this was obviously a demonstration of ESP, of actual psychic abilities, but of course it was just a magic trick." And so, yeah, listen, I think I can understand why somebody would want to be comforted, right? And of course, JMD, you said religion is one of the greatest scams of all time. Hey, isn't that just basically what I said on steroids, right? You know, it's one thing for someone to go to a spiritual medium because it comforts them to think that their dead relatives are watching over them. Isn't it much more just a comfort mechanism to believe that you're going to see your loved ones again in heaven someday? So us Christians, aren't we guilty of the ultimate scam? Well, listen, of course, as a Christian apologist, I do think there is evidence that the Christian worldview is true. I've talked about this before. I think I'm convinced heaven is real. And could I make a succinct argument for that right now off the top of my head? I could give what I believe is philosophical evidence, but no, I couldn't prove it to you, right? All I know is I've been studying this for years and years and years and years, and I think the Christian worldview is true. I think there's evidence for it. So, and again, I'm not going to get into all the things. Know that it's not merely a comfort mechanism to answer the question. I'm not a Christian because it comforts me. I'm a very pessimistic person. I have a very pessimistic personality. I have a very negative outlook on things. And that includes myself and my own worldviews, and I question my beliefs all the time. Trust me, if I wanted to believe something specifically for comforting reasons, if that was the way my mind works, I don't think Christianity would be the first place I would go. It's not easy being a Christian. It really isn't. You know, that's kind of one thing that you hear in church sometimes. They're like, oh, it's not always easy being a follower of God. And of course, that's one of the problems I have with a lot of the preachers who say things like, oh, God, like the prosperity gospel, God wants you to be healthy and wealthy. Like, that's not true. Jesus promised us that we would have trials and tribulations and troubles in this world. He didn't promise us a comfy life. I'm getting off into a tangent. While I'm finishing this tangent, by the way, people feel free to drop more questions in the live chat. I was going to say something specifically, right? I think truth, and this is the way my mind just works. I'm not a very emotive type of person. I don't seek beliefs emotively. I'm a very logical thinker. I seek things rationally. And my highest value in life is truth. I want the truth, and I want the truth to be above all else. And I'm going to believe the truth. And there have been several instances where I had to do this. I believe the true thing over what I thought would be the comforting thing. And it's not always easy in the moment, but I would say in the long run, it always ends up being better. It always ends up being way better to go with what's true than just what makes you feel good. And sort of this idea of consulting a spiritual medium because it makes you feel better that your loved one's watching over you. Look, I remember when I was 8 years old. And I don't know that I've ever told this story on air before because it can easily make my mom sound harsh, and that's not at all the case. She was obviously very loving in the moment, and the way she communicated to me was very gentle. But she was honest, and she was telling me the truth over what would be a false belief that comforted me. So when I remember I was 8 years old when my uncle passed away. I was really close with my uncle. So I was just devastated. And I remember having a conversation with my aunt over the phone where she told me that my uncle, he was watching over me from heaven. And so I shouldn't feel bad because, you know, he can see me, and, you know, he's there in heaven. He's watching over me. But I remember I was still really upset and devastated. I remember one night, 8 years old, I was just crying in the middle of the night, and my mom came in, and she asked me why, and I said because I miss my uncle. And I told her that my aunt had told me that he's watching over me from heaven. And again, this makes my mom sound harsh. It wasn't like a harsh correction, like, no, that's not the truth. Here's what the truth really is. What she said in a very comforting and gentle way, but she said, well, listen, what we really believe isn't that he can see us because heaven is a place of joy. And your uncle, he's happy right now. He's in the presence of God. He's experiencing only joy. There's no sorrow in heaven. There's no sickness in heaven. And if he could see how sad you were right now, that would make him sad. And there isn't any sadness in heaven. So it's not necessarily the case that he's watching over you, but it is the case that he's happier now than he's ever been because he's in the fullness of God's presence. And I remember after that, so contrast those two things: the comforting lie, which is that your loved one's watching over you, and then maybe the harsher truth that no, he's not. After that, I think I was mostly fine, because what ended up being the real comfort to me was not thinking that he was not kind of a selfish thing where he was watching over me, but knowing that he was happy, that he was in heaven, and that there's no sorrow or sadness in heaven. And so in that case, I think, again, as Christians, and again, I don't think you should be an evidenceless Christian. I don't think you should believe it just because it's a comforting mechanism. But I do think that is something that the Christian worldview has to offer people who are upset because they've lost someone, and want comfort. Now, of course, that's a much harsher reality. I mean, that's a much different discussion. If maybe your loved one wasn't saved or you don't know, obviously that's a very different discussion. But I do think there's evidence that the Christian worldview is true, as opposed to I don't think there's evidence that there are people who can really communicate with supposed spirits of loved ones. And so I think that's a great distinction between the two worldviews. Not that the one's necessarily solid worldview, but I do think that's what Christianity has to offer people. And seeing that there's no more questions, I'm going to end the live stream. I thank you guys a lot for watching. Share with your friends, subscribe to the channel if you're here for the first time, or if you just haven't yet. And I really appreciate you guys, and I will see you either, I don't know if I'll see you here first or I'll see you on JMD's channel first. Actually, this Sunday, so this won't be live, but this Sunday I am doing a Devil's Advocate with Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. We are going to be debating whether or not, why shouldn't be, we say we are going to be debating, Michael Jones is going to be debating atheist Maxwell Yates on whether or not consciousness can in any way serve as evidence for an immaterial soul or evidence for a God. Maxwell will be taking the position that there's just a brain, no such thing as an immaterial soul or anything like this. And of course, in principle, it's not even evidence for mind. Michael Jones will be arguing the opposite, that mind is foundational, that it is evidence for God. So we will record that Sunday. I will plan to edit it and have it released later that same week. So stay tuned for that. And if you haven't seen my last video, that was actually a lot of fun. That was a while ago, but I just recently released it. I was invited on my friend Gabe's. Actually, my friend Nick actually set it up because he knew. I didn't know Gabe and Nick, but my friend Nick was like, "Hey, my friends Gabe and Nick, they have this podcast, and they just talk about all kinds of interesting things and interview all kinds of people." And so he set me up with them. So that was a really fun conversation. Gabe is straight up agnostic. Nick is an agnostic who leans towards atheism. So I think that's the most recent video on my channel before this one. So that was a really fun discussion we had on their podcast. And then they sent me the audio so I could upload it. But it was a lot of fun. I had planned, because I didn't know the worldviews. I had suspected that we were going to spend most of the time on evidence for God. Their question, we spent most of the time on just the evidence for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection in the New Testament. And it was just a lot of fun. I was surprised how much they were interested in that specifically. They didn't really have too much problem with the evidence for a theistic God. They were like, yeah, that seems reasonable, but why Jesus? Why Christianity? And so we spent most of our time on that topic. So check out that video. It was a lot of fun. Again, thanks guys for being here, and I'll see you next time that I see you.